Hello, and welcome back to another update where I cover the latest developments throughout the front line in the Russo-Ukrainian war. It is your host, Kupiansk, and in this one, the Russians have made a significant amount of advances from Kupiansk in the north to Zaporizhia in the south. Yet another day without any developments in the Sumy region, confirming my suspicions that the Russians have turned completely to the defensive following the arrival of Ukrainian reinforcements, and they are taking full advantage of the relocation of the Ukrainian forces by launching an offensive in the east. The Russians here managed to advance in the direction of Makhmudivka and further east in the direction of Zaporizhia region. The Russians made numerous advances within the Donetsk region, mainly in the southwestern outskirts of it and to the west of Pokrovsk, as well as to the east of the city. There is a large push. The Russians also managed to advance in the direction of Makhmudivka across the Serbs river line and in the direction of Kupiansk. Starting out in the south, the Russian advance in the direction of Makhmudivka is them securing the southern flank of the initial push into the town, where they've managed to gain control over the farm area, allowing for an additional road into the town from the south. The Russians also advance in the northern parts of the residential area, where they're looking to push into the wide part of it, where the Ukrainians have a defensive line centered around the prison area to the south, and the wide part of the residential area to the west. The Russians are here pressuring this entire defensive line by storming the prison area and the residential area. Prior to that, they launched several strikes, including artillery, FPV drones, as well as FAB bombs on the Ukrainian prepared lines before storming it with armored vehicles and infantry, mostly now that they have entrenched themselves within the town of Makhmudivka. Further to the east, the Russians advanced in the direction of Makhmudivka, securing the southern road into the town by gaining control over the forest lines to the south of the farm area and on the western flank of the town. This is to have additional routes into Makhmudivka for offensive operations into the northern parts of the town. In the Donetsk region itself, there are numerous advances. The Russians advanced here northwest of Fedorivka in the direction of Mirne, where the Russians gain control over one of the fortified positions, and to connect their bridgehead across Komar with their positions near Fedorivka, gain control over a wide area west of the Mokriali river line for future offensive operations in the direction of Mirne, Vidopne, and the western direction in the direction of Voskresenka. Gain control over the crossing will allow the Russians to build pontoon bridges for most heavier vehicles that don't have river crossing capabilities to pass through, as well as supply trucks and infantry. The Russians have managed to gain control of a wider area of the river line, of the northern bank of the Vovcha river line, here into the Dnipropetrovsk region. Following the capture of Dashne, the Russians captured the remaining fortified positions and have full control over the southern flank of Dnipropetrovsk as a bridgehead into the Dnipropetrovsk region. There's also an advance by the Russians here to the southwest of Bohdyanivka, as the Russians consider offensive operations to gain control over the border area and into the Dnipropetrovsk region for offensive operations towards the town of Novopavlivka from the northeast, southeast, and south. The Russians are likely also pushing in the direction of Filia in the southwestern flank of Novopavlivka, with the continuous push in the western direction following the capture of Dashne. With this, we see the Russians continue offensive operations to gain control over the logistical hubs of the Ukrainians on a wide western flank of Pokrovsk, similar to the operations to the east of Pokrovsk. Directly to the southwest of Pokrovsk, the Russians gained control over some of the fortified positions along the forest patch area and the railway, connecting their forces near Pishana and Svirove with the ones near Shevchenko. Russians managed to close this pocket of Ukrainian forces and gain control over the forest patch area, which allows them to launch offensive operations into the residential area here to the southwest of Pokrovsk. The Russians are expanding their offensive operations towards the city itself as they are attacking both the eastern and western flanks of it. The eastern flank, they are getting close to storming the defensive line located east of Pokrovsk, while on the western flank they already have control over parts of the western defensive line. However, they do not have control over the wider flank. Speaking of the wider flank, the Russians made numerous advances on the eastern flank of Pokrovsk. To the north of Rodivka, the Russians captured this fortified position and started storming the next fortified positions here west of the town to secure the supply lines leading into the direction of Mirnorad and the eastern flank of Pokrovsk. They also advanced to the west of Mirolyubivka, gaining control over some fortified position there, in an objective to gain control over the fortified positions cutting off the connection between Prodivka and Myrolyubivka for a wider bridgehead across the Kasenyi-Turets river line. The Russians also managed to make several advances on the defensive line of the Ukrainians east of Pokrovsk that connects Pokrovsk with Drushkivka further northeast in the direction of the Sloviansk-Konstantinivka line. This defensive line is being stormed by the Russian forces, mainly centered around Novotoretsk, where we see that the Russians managed to gain control over numerous fortified positions in a combined assault from the northeastern flank. Following the captured fortified position there, they managed to gain a crossing across the anti-tank ditch and Dragon Teeth repaired, from which they launched an assault from the rear of these defensive lines, captured the trenches here to the east of Novotoretsk. From the southeastern direction, the Russians stormed to the fortified positions of the Ukrainians head-on. This allowed them to connect their flank from the east and from the south together and gain a foothold on the eastern parts of the town. The Russians also managed to gain control over several fortified positions here to the northwest of Makhmudivka. With control over these fortified positions, they have secured yet another defensive line between Shevchenko-Pershing and Makhmudivka that opens the road for future offensive operations in the westward direction. Following the capture of Myrne, the Russians are now storming Mykolaiivka and Novoekonomishne, as they are fighting over the fortified positions on the eastern flank of the town. They also bypassed some of these fortified positions to storm the town from the northern flank and bypass the defensive line of the Ukrainians in the area. The Russians are doing a wide assault, directly storming the fortified positions and the defensive line of the Ukrainians here to the east of Pokrovsk. Russians also made a small advance here to the southwest of Chasiv Yar, gaining control over this fortified position and widening their control over the northern parts of the anti-tank ditch and Dragon Teeth line. Russians are here looking to secure the flanks of Chasiv Yar for an even wider assault on the defensive line in the direction of Volodymyrivka and the towns in between that and Novotoretsk. Further to the east, the Russians managed to advance just southwest of Chasiv Yar, northwest of Chasiv Yar, and north of Priorivka. To the southwest of Chasiv Yar, the Russians are expanding their zone of control within the outskirts of the city to connect the forces within Chasiv Yar with the forces in Stepushki. They need to gain control over the remaining parts of Chasiv Yar, again the southwestern outskirts. Also storming the fortified positions of the Ukrainians to the southeast of Mykolaiivka, gain control over the fortified positions and residential area in the area, and start storming Mykolaiivka itself from the first patch area in the north and the residential area to the east. In the northern flank, the Russians gained control of an additional street and entered into the first patch area, gaining control over some fortified positions in the area and establishing themselves a foothold within it for future offensive operations in the northwestern and southwestern directions. To the north of Ryurivka, the Russians managed to gain control over some fortified positions and forest lines on the eastern bank of the canal, advancing and connecting their forces with Ryurivka to the ones in the southern flank of Oryhov-Vasilivka. Russians will likely look to gain control over the southern flank of Oryhov-Vasilivka, not to storm those towns, but to cross over in the direction of Novomarkova and Markova. There is also the potential that they will launch offensive operations in the direction of Oryhov-Vasilivka itself, where they already have a foothold within the town, and continue offensive operations alongside the canal to the north in an attempt to cut off the flank of Siversk, now that the Russians are within close proximity to the town, for the possibility of storming it directly head-on. Further north in the direction of the Serbets river line, the Russians managed to gain control of an additional forest line to the south of Zelena Dolina as they continue offensive operations towards Lyman on the northern flank, where they've been launching some offensive operations in the western direction along the river line and in the southern direction along the main road to connect their forces in the logistical hub of Anove down towards Lyman in the south. Further north in the direction of Kupiansk, the Russians continued offensive operations within the town of Grushkivka, where they already have control over fortified positions to the east, and with control over the road leading up to Grushkivka, the Russians will continue offensive operations into the town, both towards the farm area in the eastern parts and the forest area in the western parts, moving through the residential area in the center, which is really a one-way street, where we see that there is a singular street with residential buildings on both sides of it, leading all the way up to Novosunova, where there's a lot of dacha areas, residential vacation areas here in the southern flank of Kupiansk, moving further up along these towns and settlements, all the way up to Kupiansk. In general, we are seeing a significant intensification of Russian offensive operations in the eastern section of the front line, What we're seeing is that the Russians continue their 20 to 30 square kilometer advance on a daily basis, but now it's almost completely centered within the Donetsk region, with no advances in the northern section of the front line. There are some minor advances in the Kupiansk and Zaporizhia section, but in Zaporizhia section, the Russian operations are not as developed as they are within the Donetsk region. They have to storm these fortified positions from the very beginning, which limits the Russian advances. Instead, the Russians have progressed a lot in the Donetsk region, where in some areas they are not even facing that many fortified positions any longer, and this gives them a significant advantage when fighting against the Ukrainians. Now we are seeing that the Russians continued offensive operations centered around the Donetsk region, mainly focused on Pokrovsk and Kupiansk, where the main focus is on Pokrovsk on both the eastern and western flanks, all the way into the Dnipropetrovsk region, and the town of Chasiv Yar to the east of Kupiansk. And that is going to be all for this update. Thank you all for watching. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe, check out my Patreon and YouTube membership for additional content. Thank you all for watching and have a great day.